These technologies produce what is called artificial snow. The people in the industry prefer to call it technical snow. And this type of solution is, to a certain extent, saving the activity because it provides reliable production of snow throughout the entire season, and so it provides continuity. However, at the same time, we know it is an energy and water-intensive type of activity, and the snow, once fallen on the ground, still requires cold temperature to stay. Formula One has to be seen as a moon race. In doing so, we've been burning a lot of fuel, consuming a lot of material, but the things that we learned in space, despite not being net zero per se, helped us become more sustainable and improve life, improve medical conditions. The issue is that we become complacent, we become overconfident on our possibilities.
Sport is often where we see climate change in miniature. Some sports are already feeling the pressure directly because the weather and seasons they depend on are becoming less reliable. Others are trying to reinvent themselves technologically, promising cleaner, smarter futures without giving up what makes them commercially successful. Today we're looking at two very different examples. In part one, skiing, a sport that increasingly depends on artificial snow to survive, even as that solution creates new environmental and social pressures. In part two, Formula One, a sport often criticised as wasteful, but which today's guest, Professor Paolo Aversa from King's Business School, argues may be one of the few that genuinely drives technological innovation with wider value. Welcome to Office Hours. Paolo, welcome. Why is skiing such a revealing place to start this conversation at?
It was born originally as a simple mean of transportation, but today is a global industry that provides support to many local economies, provides support to many industrial activities that are needed for the production of the equipment, for the production of the ski lifts, and many other social activities, such as, for example, the Olympic Games or the World Cup of skiing. However, it is also a practice that requires certain natural conditions. The simplest one is cold weather. Cold weather is usually correlated also with precipitations. So we need snow from the sky, ideally, and cold temperature to keep the snow stable on the ground throughout the season. The problem we are facing today is that with climate change, the conditions to allow natural snow to precipitate and to remain are increasingly disrupted by rising temperatures, which means that even when the snow falls, unfortunately, it doesn't last more than a few days. As a response to this, the industry leaders through the years have developed new technologies. These technologies allow to produce what is called artificial snow. The people in the industry prefer to call it technical snow. And this type of solution is, to a certain extent, saving the activity because it provides reliable production of snow throughout the entire season, and so it provides continuity to the business activity. However, at the same time, we know it is an energy and water-intensive type of activity, and the snow, once fallen on the ground, still requires cold temperature to stay. So in certain locations, where the temperature have risen up to a certain level. These days on the Alps, we are looking at location around 1,000 meters, 1,200 meters. Even artificial snow may no longer be the case, the solution for this industry.
How widespread has artificial snow become? And one of the striking things that you talk about is just how normalised it is and how reliant those resorts and modern skiing, especially as we say in Italy, is on that machine-made or technical snow.
These days, it is unthinkable to start a skiing resort without artificial snow machines and equipment. It has become the standard in most resorts. At the moment in Italy, between 90 and 95% of the resorts are deploying, to some extent, artificial snow production. So it has basically become a reality. In other countries, the percentage might be lower because the structure of the mountains, the latitude where these mountains are, the altitude might create more favorable conditions. But these days, it is a reality. Italy is probably the focal point globally for snow production through artificial technologies for two reasons. First of all, it is the country that has experienced the sharpest rise in temperature and the major reduction in precipitation. And for this reason, the companies were born and developed in that area, particularly in the area of Bolzano. There are two companies that basically put together account for around the 80% of the global market, which are Techno Alpine and Maklenko, both in the same region, both in the same area. And they're basically two market leaders that provide technology all through the season to the other resorts around the world.
So this isn't just a case of a few bad winters and you need it. It's sort of, you're saying, baked in to, I guess, the business plans of ski resorts, starting with Italy and expanding out as you get, I suppose, as you get higher, but it's the lower ones that are coming up against it at the moment.
The issue of lack of snow and ideal condition for skiing first appeared in the 70s in the US, when during an Olympic edition there were at the time what was considered an exceptional year with very low amount of snow. And for that specific reason, they went looking for technology that could provide sort of a patch to the problem, thinking, oh, this will be a one-off thing. As time passed and as the situation worsened, this became more and more common, and now it's basically a basic fix in every single industry, in every single country. The point here is that the customers these days expect artificial snow for two reasons. First of all, because it provides the reliability of when the season will start and will end, and how much snow there will be at least on the pistes. And the second reason is because artificial snowmaking allows to choose the type of snow that you want to produce. So you can have snow that is wetter or drier. And for this reason, they can provide snow that is ideal for skiing field, for skiing condition. So regardless of the idea that, skiing on natural snow may be nice, actually, professional skiers and these days also everyday skiers expect certain kind of snow that can produce only by controlling it through machines.
You say that you can control it from an iPad, so you could have somebody miles and miles away sort of tweaking as you see fit. Really, really interesting. But is it still a little bit misunderstood? So I imagine that people see it as being maybe full of chemicals or fake materials. So what is it in simple terms, and why has it become so effective?
It's just water sprayed basically over a fan of very, very cold air. Of course, I'm simplifying here. So the water transforms into crystals and falls on the ground. However, to produce this snow, you need a lot of energy, you need a lot of water. The water needs to be contained in artificial water basins, which are helpful for many things, but at the same time quite invasive to place on the mountains. And there needs to be an entire system of piping that connects the water basin to guns, snow guns. And ultimately, you need a lot of digital technologies because it all boils down to optimizing the time when you produce. So the lower the temperature in the air, the less energy you require. Now, when a resort prepares for the season, it requires more or less 5 days of intense snowmaking to create the first frozen layer at the bottom of the slope that will basically reach the end of the season. Then on top of that, they put more, let's say, drier snow, more powdery. That is the one we ski on effectively. If there is 1 or 2 degrees of difference in the temperature, maybe it's a bit warmer, it means in terms of energy consumption, gigawatts of energy across an area or a resort.
Snowmaking accounts for 30 to 40% of the total energy consumption of Italian ski resorts. The annual energy-related costs are between 50 to 100 million euros. The LANT systems, which you just mentioned there, can use between 0.6 and 0.7 kilowatt hours per cubic metre. And the fan guns use around 1 to 2 kilowatt hours per cubic metre. As you've said, when it gets a bit too warm, and you'd call them unfavourable conditions, you're looking at 14 kilowatt hours per cubic metre. And across the Alps, the total demand is 2,100 gigawatt hours per winter season, which we calculated at 2,100 flux capacitors from Back to the Future, and about the annual electricity use of 500,000 homes.
These are incredibly impressive numbers. To be honest, the machines have become more and more efficient with time, and there's a huge push to make them less impactful as possible. And in many areas of the Alps, particularly in the area of Trentino, Alto Adige and Bolzano, most of the energy comes from renewables. But still, it's a huge amount of energy, a huge amount of water. The water pretty much ratio remains the same. It requires more water to produce artificial snow than the water falling from the sky. There are different type of arguments. People say that the system borrow water. They don't steal water in the sense that they take it from the environment, they return it to the environment. This water will transform into snow, then will melt, will go again into the land, evaporate and come back. But still, it's a massive endeavor to make this whole system work.
Just on the snowmaking in Italy, you're looking at between 100 and 150 million cubic meters of water annually, and we try and, with these things, put them into something that maybe people could understand, and I think we came up with the figure of about 60,000 Olympic-sized swimming pools, and it's the equivalent, roughly, annual water usage of between 1 and 1.5 million people.
It's a lot of water indeed. And what they're trying to do at the moment is to make this water helpful for other reasons. For example, in case of fire, during summer, the water basin can be used when there is still water there. For example, to provide water for animals. So it can be helpful to a variety of reasons, but it is and it will remain highly impactful. And most of all, if at some point those resorts can no longer produce snow, this infrastructure are incredibly difficult, almost impossible to remove.
So this is where your research becomes especially interesting, because you argue that adaptation can become a trap and that the success of artificial snow can create a kind of climate complacency. So what do you mean by that?
So the problem is not that artificial snow doesn't work. The problem is that it works even too well. And it allowed many communities to believe that we will always be able to come up with something that will eventually resolve the problem. The truth is that this might not be the case, and there will be a point of no return beyond which even shooting artificial snow will be unfeasible, because the temperature will not be there to maintain it for more than a few hours or a few days.
And we've used the term expiring industries before. I think you compared it to expiring food. You know, food that is okay for today may not be okay for tomorrow, and skiing looks like it is in that category.
Skiing, as many other industries that are based on natural resources, is indeed in that category. And the issue is that by adopting technologies that prolong, or at least give us the impression to prolong that expiry date, we become complacent, we become overconfident on our possibilities.
The snowpack is that first layer of snow, isn't it? That then you
build
the rest
on
of the slope on. It's declined by between 20 and 30% since the 1980s. Projections indicate a further 40 to 60% decline by 2100 under high emission scenarios. So resorts below that 1500 metre mark have seen seasons shortened by 20 to 30 days over the past 2 decades. 50% of Italian resorts below 1,500 metres may be unviable by 2050, compared with 30% above 2,000 metres. So this is something that is not just an Italian problem, it is an Italian problem at the moment, and I guess it will then expire. But as you move further up the mountains, those resorts are going to start to fall as well, unless something can be done.
Yes, that's precisely the point. And technology is helping, of course, to maintain it, but it won't be a fix in the long run. And so I think the important aspect is that particularly policymakers provide resources for the communities to transfer to new type of activities. As I mentioned, these other activities are by all means less remunerative. They need subsidies for a transition that, at least in the short term, will be, let's say, will put them worse off.
Let's pivot slightly. So say even if skiing does survive, it may survive in a more exclusive form. So I guess the question would be, how is climate adaptation changing who gets to ski?
Well, these days, exposure to the beauty of nature and the freedom of nature have become the ultimate luxury. Living on a mountain top once was considered something for poor people. Now, good luck if you can take a week off and go skiing. I am born and raised in an area that is not too far from the Dolomites, which are some of the most beautiful ski resorts and let's say mountains in Italy. When I was a child, most of my friends were able to ski, and their parents, used to take them. It was a classic middle class type of activity. These days, the children of my friends rarely know how to ski. Only those that are better off can afford to take their kids to learn how to ski. The general pattern we see is that technology helps extend the life of the industry, but technology is expensive because of the energy, because of the infrastructure, because the investments. As a result, what happens is that the cost gets transferred into higher prices for access. For example, the ski pass have raised enormously across the world, and all the other technology, all the other equipment, all the other, let's say, hotels, parking, follow the same trend. The type of activity repositions from everyday mean of transportation at the beginning to a middle class enjoyment, now to an elite, more recently, elite sport, elite activity, because there are people who are willing and able to pay those kind of sums. The industry become complacent that this is doable. But at the same time, it crowds out local communities that actually have helped to build the entire industry.
The $1 million question, I suppose, in this instance, if the current model risks becoming more resource intensive or more unequal, more fragile, what should a better response look like?
A better response would be, first of all, a diversified response, and one that is in part, let's say, subsidized by the governments. So putting money into something that is a bit more long-term and allows also other communities that are already been excluded from the golden egg of skiing to create their own tourism offering, maybe leveraging other kind of interesting aspects like astronomy, culture, other kind of sports that don't require snow.
So in skiing, the warning is that technology can make a threatened model look more secure than it really is. In Formula One, the question almost runs the other way. Can a sport that looks inherently wasteful still generate the kind of technological innovation that helps the wider transition? We're going to turn to Formula One and the case for net zero fuel. At first glance, it almost feels like the opposite of a climate-friendly sport. Fast cars, global travel, huge infrastructure, enormous budgets. A lot of people would look at F1 and see wasteful extravagance. Formula One's case for itself is not just that it entertains, but that it functions as a high-pressure R&D lab whose innovations have spilled into wider society. In other words, F1's strongest defence is that, beyond the spectacle, it has repeatedly turned extreme engineering for racing into practical tools with value far beyond the track.
Formula One has to be seen as a moon race. We go to space, and we've been going to space, and in doing so, we've been burning a lot of fuel, consuming a lot of material. But the things that we learned in space, despite not being net zero per se, helped us become more sustainable and improve life, improve medical conditions on the planet. Formula One is basically the same thing. It's a cutting-edge technological sport where technologies are developed to go into the wider world and change the way how we live, making cars safer and save lives, improving the connection and data transmission system in transport system, in hospitals, including Children's Hospital, and resolving many other problems at the speed of light, ideally. So it is, together with other prototypical and prototype-based motorsports, a lab for new knowledge, a lab for new technology. The truth is that most sports in the world are not like that. I like football, I like basketball, but to be honest, they don't produce much for society beside the excitement of the sport, a lot of inspiration, good values, and maybe a new pair of sneakers or trainers to wear when you play your own sports. Formula One has saved thousands of lives because of the technology that has been developed through the year. And the next chapter of Formula One aims to change the world once more.
If we look at how maybe regulation is shaped to push teams to develop reusable technology, and maybe a little bit about, I know it's sort of in its infancy as we record this, but the 2026 season of the Formula One has been a little bit slower than maybe people would have imagined it to be.
Yes, so Formula One has introduced regulations to make the sport safer, but also to create technologies that could go into the wider world and make it a better place. In 2009, Formula One transformed purely combustion engine into hybrid powertrain for the first time. There was a mix of combustion engine, which was an incredibly efficient engine. We're looking at engines that are 1,600 cc, so smaller than most cars that you see these days on the road, and that compete at the top speed with just one tank of fuel. These days, Formula One cars don't refuel anymore, and the rest comes from a hybrid system that collects heat from different parts, these days only from the brakes, transforms it into electrical energy, puts into a battery, and makes it available for boost and overtaking. So basically, a little bit like a Toyota Prius, slightly more powerful. But these days, the Formula One has embraced this philosophy even further, and the new engines are 50% combustions and 50% hybrid. Not only the new engine are supposed to function on net zero fuel. What do we mean by net zero fuel? It is a fuel that doesn't come from fossil fuel, basically. It comes from, in part, basically elaboration of existing materials, of synthetic materials, and which are more sustainable, less impactful for nature, and at the same time some offsetting exercises.
We always talk about F1 and we always talk about the amount of money that's involved in it, and the extravagances, as I said in the intro, is always up there as one of the top sports for expenditure. This net zero fuel is no exception, is it? Because it is circa $140 a gallon, which in its current form is extremely expensive.
Definitely more expensive than what we normally would buy for our cars. But the way in which we should look at this is, first of all, Formula One is a lab. So the technologies that they develop need to be then scaled up to a size that can basically be distributed across the world. So it needs to be simplified, scaled down, have economies of scale, economies of different kind of learning, so that everybody can actually afford it. Another aspect is that the fuel per se is a drop-in fuel, meaning it will work in every car on the planet without any modification. So it doesn't require any changes in the car that we have, which is a completely different proposition than considering a transition to alternative type of powertrains. So, for example, the transition from combustion to electric had a hidden cost, which is what do we do with the millions and millions of cars that are perfectly functioning and going around the world? What do we do with the many batteries that will be useless in a few years from now when these cars start aging? Where do we find the materials that are needed to build these batteries? So there are a lot of open questions. So of course, if you look at an electrical vehicle per se, it doesn't produce any CO2, but practically the whole process of building the vehicle, reusing the batteries or getting rid of them, producing the electricity that needs to power the batteries is a big question marks that very few people have tried to address.
So you can just, in theory, drive up, if you've got $140 a gallon out there to be spending on this at the moment. We're very early stages, but the idea is it's completely transitional. So you're not going to be dealing with any waste. It sounds almost perfect, almost too good to be true.
Well, we'll see whether they're going to be able to scale it up and when, but every team has partnered with one of the major fuel producers. So, for example, Ferrari was working with Shell, Mercedes was working with Petronas, and the involvement of these companies is precisely because they hope to create a market opportunity out of this. They wouldn't be in that if this ended up just being a beautiful sustainability exercise.
We're saying that part of the net zero part of the fuel comes from offsetting. So as more and more people potentially use it, would that become more difficult for it to be net zero as the offsetting becomes less?
I think that the offsetting can be basically measured, scaled up in proportion to the production. They effectively don't have a system to produce this at high scale. So we still have to figure out how this will actually look like once it's defined. But what we know is that for sure these fuels do not use fossil materials, and that makes a huge difference. Also in geography of if you think of energy industries where the fossil fuel come from, which are finite resources, so to a certain extent they're also expiring industries, just like skiing.
I suppose a lot of people, I know you've already touched on it slightly, saying why not just electrify everything, but you've sort of said actually the batteries are problematic just because of the minerals, I suppose, or the rare earth that you need to actually produce these. You're not anti-EV in any way, and obviously that you have Formula E as well. So I suppose, were they caught between brands where you say, well, we actually can't go fully electric because we've already got Formula E, and is nobody watching it comparatively to F1?
Formula One is massively bigger than Formula E, although Formula E has grown constantly year on year and attracted very important constructor. There are two, I think, noble endeavors, both Formula E and Formula One. They're both endowed by the Federación Internacional del Automóvil, FIA, the federation. The Formula One regulation change that we see today was started being envisioned in 2021. It was a different time, it was a different zeitgeist. We were thinking probably the transition to electric would have been bigger and quicker than what has actually happened. They couldn't go fully electric because Formula E already existed. So they really pushed forward for a full hybrid type of logic, where the hybrid was not a minority, but was at least a 50% of the whole power unit, which is what we see today. Of course, a hybrid engine also needs batteries. It needs them less than a fully electric engine, but the problem of batteries still comes about exactly in the same way. And there is also an aspect related to whether this type of technology will be able to be transferred in a reasonable time to standard road cars. It's not the first time the Formula One is hybrid, but the technology that they adopted before was so complicated that the spin-off of those technology only ended up in hypercars, multi-million cars that few people can basically afford. Instead, what they're aiming to do is to create now a technology that can be scaled to our everyday road cars.
And we think about the combustion engine being around a hell of a lot longer than electrical versions, but that's just not the case. I mean, you can go back to Victorian England where they would have had those sort of very, very early models that contained basically all of the electricity, I suppose, was contained within glass. And the reason that it didn't pick up is because all of the cobbled streets, they just smash against each other all the time. So, it's not the newest of technologies, is it? When you actually go back and think, oh, okay, this is just basically that London streets were just a bit...
Yeah, these days London streets would also create the same problems if the technology was based on glass, I have to say. But overall, yeah, electric vehicles are as old as, more or less, as combustion engine. The point is we have decided to go for a trajectory that we thought had more promise. And through the years, we've become better and better at creating efficient engines that consume less, that pollute less, and that's great. There is, I believe that, whenever we look at sustainability in transportation, we have to look at the impact on the entire ecosystem, the entire supply chain. We can't just look at the single vehicle and say, okay, how much CO2 does the vehicle produce? We need to look at what happens for the production of the vehicle, for the reusage of its parts, and we need to look at how the energy that the vehicle needs is produced. It will never become a net zero activity, but I think as long as what they produce is valuable, the final output is more positive than a sport that is also not net zero, but doesn't produce anything for humanity. I was at a football stadium a few weeks ago, and everybody was drinking from plastic cups, single use. Okay, one can say get recycled, but it's not that recycling is net zero as a type of activity.
Just before we wrap up, just some quick fire questions for you. Where is the best place to ski?
Oh, where your heart is, for me, is Veneto and in the Dolomites, but that's where my home is.
And who's going to win the Drivers' Championship this season?
I'm Italian, and in Italy we say that we have two religions, a Roman Catholic Church and Ferrari. So I have to say Ferrari. Let's see whether Leclerc or Lewis Hamilton.
Fantastic. Professor Paolo Aversa from King's Business School there. Today's episode asks what sports gets right and wrong when it confronts climate change. In skiing, the warning is that adaptation can become a trap. In Formula One, the case is that high-performance sport may also function as a lab for wider change. Two very different sports then. One common question: when does innovation genuinely move us forward? And when does it simply help us postpone harder choices? You've been listening to Office Hours. Make sure you do drop us a follow, subscribe on YouTube, and if you've got any questions for Paolo, email us via business@kcl.ac.